The rusty bell above the glass door chimed sharply, cutting through the quiet hum of the street. Inside, the air smelled like old wood, guitar polish, and the faint, dusty scent of history. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where time moves slow, and the local music shop was mostly empty, save for a few browsers strumming acoustic guitars in the corner. Maya stepped through the doorway first, clutching her backpack straps tightly. She was a young woman of 19, dressed in faded jeans and a band t-shirt, her eyes darting around the room with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She was here for a reason. She had saved up for months to buy a specific snare drum, and today was finally the day to test it out. But the moment the second person followed her in, the atmosphere in the shop shifted completely. The soft strumming of guitars in the corner seemed to stop. The guy behind the counter, who had been polishing a trumpet, froze in place. Maya's grandfather, Vince, ducked his head to clear the doorframe and stomped inside. He was a mountain of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall. He wore a heavy, black leather vest that had seen better days, with patches sewn onto the fabric and a logo on the back that screamed biker gang. Underneath, his arms were thick and covered in tattoos, and his gray beard was braided on either side, resting against a chest that looked like it could stop a bullet. Heavy engineer boots thudded loudly against the wooden floor as he walked, echoing like warning shots. Maya felt her face get hot. She was used to this people staring at her grandpa wherever they went, but in a quiet music shop, it felt 10 times louder. She loved Vince more than anything, but his look was intense. He looked like he had just walked off the set of an action movie, or perhaps straight out of a bar fight. She knew he was a softie on the inside, the kind of man who cried at sad movies and helped kittens out of trees, but the strangers in the shop didn't know that. They just saw the leather, the beard, and the scowl. Vince didn't seem to notice the stares, or maybe he just didn't care. He looked around the shop with interest, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Smells like dedication in here," he rumbled. His voice was deep, like gravel rolling in a drum barrel. "It's just dust and polish, Grandpa," Maya whispered, trying to pull him toward the back room before he scared anyone away. "No, it's the smell of hard work," Vince insisted, gently patting her shoulder with a hand that was nearly twice the size of hers. They walked past the rows of electric guitars hanging on the wall, their glossy bodies reflecting the afternoon light. A younger guy, maybe in his early 20s, was trying out a bright red electric guitar. He looked up as Vince passed by, his eyes going wide, and he quickly unplugged his amp, suddenly very interested in his shoes. Maya sighed internally. Her grandpa was a gentle giant, but his appearance was like a force field that cleared the room. They reached the back of the store where the percussion section was located. Drum sets of all shapes and sizes were set up, from jazz kits to massive rock setups. In the center, shining under a spotlight, sat the snare drum Maya had been dreaming about. It was a brass beauty, and she couldn't wait to hear how it sounded. The shop clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and kind eyes, walked over. He looked nervous as he glanced at Vince, but he smiled warmly at Maya. "Hey there," the clerk said. "You must be Maya. You called about the brass snare." "Yeah, that's me," Maya said, her voice gaining confidence now that they were talking about music. "This is my grandpa, Vince. He drove me here." Vince offered a nod, his expression neutral. "Good afternoon." The clerk swallowed hard but returned the nod. "Nice to meet you. Go ahead, Maya. Have a seat. Let's hear what you can do." Maya walked over to the drum throne. She ran her hand over the smooth metal of the snare drum, feeling the vibration before she even hit it. This was her world. On the drums, she didn't have to be the shy girl with the scary biker grandpa. She could be powerful, precise, and loud. She sat down and adjusted the height of the seat. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Vince leaning against a pillar a few feet away. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, settling into weight. He looked completely out of place next to the shiny cymbals and pristine drums, like a boulder sitting in a flower garden. "Don't be nervous, kiddo," Vince said, catching her eye. "Just hit the thing." "I'm not nervous," Maya lied. She picked up a pair of sticks that the clerk had left on the music stand. She twirled them once, a nervous habit she had. The clerk leaned against a nearby amp, ready to listen. A few other customers had drifted closer, curious to hear the instrument. But Maya could feel their eyes darting back and forth between her and Vince. She knew what they were thinking. What is a rough-looking biker doing with a young girl in a music shop? Is he forcing her to be here? Is he going to cause trouble? It made her angry, but it also made her want to play better. She wanted to show them that they were wrong. She wanted to show them that despite how he looked, Vince was her biggest fan. He was the one who had bought her first pair of sticks. He was the one who sat in the garage for hours listening to her practice, keeping time on his knees because he couldn't afford a real drum kit back then. Maya took a deep breath. She positioned her hands over the drum. The shop was quiet, waiting. The silence stretched out, heavy with the unspoken judgments of the strangers. "Just a basic beat to start," the clerk suggested helpfully. "See how the snare responds to a standard groove." Maya nodded. She lifted her right hand. She was ready to play, ready to prove herself, and ready to make her grandpa proud. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, the expectations of everyone in the room would be shattered, not by her playing, but by the man standing silently in the shadows, watching her with a look of quiet pride. She tapped the hi-hat lightly, checking the sound. It was crisp. She looked at Vince one last time. He gave her a small, almost invisible nod. "Go for it," that nod said. Maya closed her eyes for a split second to focus, then opened them, lifted her wrists, and prepared to let the rhythm take over. The afternoon sun caught the dust motes dancing around them, freezing the moment in time just before the magic happened. The shop was still, the people were watching, and the grandfather stood like a statue, waiting for his cue. Maya took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to calm the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. The shop felt strangely quiet, even though a few people were milling around. She could feel their eyes on her, but more than that, she could feel the heavy, solid presence of her grandfather standing just a few feet away. Vince was like a statue, leaning against a tall shelf filled with sheet music, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He didn't look like he belonged in a music shop. He looked like he should be in a roadside bar, or maybe fixing a broken-down engine on the side of the highway. She looked down at the snare drum. It was beautiful, a shiny piece of brass that promised a crisp, sharp sound. She just had to play something simple to test it out. That was what the clerk had asked for. Nothing fancy. Just a basic beat to see if the drum was worth her hard-earned money. Maya tapped the hi-hat with her left hand. Tssst tssst. Then she hit the bass drum pedal with her right foot. Thump. Finally, she brought her right stick down on the snare. Crack. 1, 2, 3, 4. She started the pattern again, a little smoother this time. It was the most common drum beat in the world, the backbone of rock and pop music. Kick, snare, kick kick, snare. Maya focused on keeping her hands relaxed, just like her teachers told her. She didn't want to look stiff, especially with Vince watching. She knew he didn't understand the technical side of music, but he always knew when she was tense. The sound of the drum filled the small space. It was loud, but in a good way. The brass shell gave it a bright, metallic ring that cut through the air. Maya nodded to herself. It sounded good. She added a little bit of flair, tapping the ride cymbal lightly to keep the time. She was getting into a groove, letting the rhythm take over her mind. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a young guy with bright green hair standing near the electric guitars. He had stopped playing and was watching her. He looked at her, then quickly looked at Vince, and then looked away, clearly intimidated. It happened everywhere they went. People saw the beard, the leather vest with the club patches, and the heavy boots, and they immediately assumed Vince was trouble. They didn't see the man who watched cartoons with her on Saturday mornings or who made the best pancakes in the world. Maya tried to ignore the tension. She picked up the tempo slightly, her sticks moving a little faster. Chicka-boom, chicka-boom. She was concentrating hard, her tongue sticking out just a little bit the way it always did when she focused. She wanted this to be perfect. She wanted to walk out of here with that drum. The shop clerk, a friendly guy with a name tag that read Dave, nodded his head along with the beat. He was leaning against the counter, looking impressed. "Sounds tight," Dave said. "That snare has got a really nice crack to it." Maya smiled but didn't stop playing. She moved her left hand to the toms for a quick fill tom-tom-tom snare. And then went right back into the groove. She felt proud. She had been practicing for months to get her timing right, and it felt good to hear it paying off. She played for another minute, switching between the hi-hat and the ride cymbal, keeping the beat steady and solid. It wasn't a solo. It wasn't meant to show off. It was just a steady, honest rhythm. It was the kind of beat you could sing over, the kind that held everything together. Finally, she brought the song to an end with a crash on the cymbal and a final stomp on the bass drum. The ringing of the cymbal faded into the air, leaving the shop quiet once again. "Nice," Dave said, clapping his hands together softly. "Really nice. You've got great control for someone your age." "Thanks," Maya said, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her palms were a little sweaty. She looked up at Vince, expecting him to just nod or say good job. But Vince wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. His brow was furrowed, like he was thinking hard about something. He slowly unfolded his arms and pushed himself off the wall. The movement made his leather jacket creak loudly. "It was good," Vince said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Maya's chest. "But you were rushing." Maya blinked. "What? No, I wasn't. The click track was perfect in my head." Vince shook his head slowly. "On the fills. Every time you went to the toms, you rushed the beat. You were trying to get back to the snare too fast. It made you drag the kick drum." Maya felt her face get hot. She opened her mouth to argue, but then she stopped. She thought back to what she had just played. Had she been rushing maybe? Just a little. But how did he know Vince didn't play? He rode motorcycles. He fixed cars. He didn't know anything about drumming theory. Dave, the clerk, laughed a little. "He's got a point, Maya," Dave said surprisingly. "I heard a tiny bit of a rush on the last fill. Not enough to worry about, but he's got a good ear." Maya looked at her grandpa with new eyes. He was standing there, looking completely serious. He wasn't guessing. He actually heard it. Vince walked closer to the drum kit, his heavy boots thumping on the floor. He stopped right in front of the snare drum and looked down at it, almost like he was inspecting a machine. He reached out a hand, his fingers rough and calloused, and gently tapped the rim of the drum. Ping. Good wood, Vince muttered. But the head is a little loose. Dave raised his eyebrows. You can hear that. I just tuned that this morning. I can feel it, Vince said, tapping the drum again. There's no bounce. You have to work too hard to get the sound out. Maya was stunned. She looked at the clerk, who looked just as surprised. The tension in the room had changed. Before, people were staring at Vince because he looked scary. Now, they were staring because he was surprising them. The guy with the green hair had put his guitar down completely and was watching the scene unfold with interest. Vince looked at Maya, and for a second, the tough exterior cracked. He smiled at her, a small, crooked smile that made the wrinkles around his eyes deepen. You're getting better, kid. But don't let the hands run away with the brain. Feel the time, don't just count it. Maya felt a lump in her throat. That was actually really good advice. She nodded slowly. Okay, Grandpa. I'll try. Dave looked from Maya to Vince, and then a mischievous grin spread across his face. He reached behind the counter and picked up another pair of drumsticks. They were heavier than the ones Maya used, classic wooden 5A sticks with the tips worn down just a little. So, Dave said, tossing the sticks toward Vince. Vince caught them effortlessly in one big hand. Since you know so much about the tuning and the timing, maybe you should show us how it's done. Just a little taste. The room went dead silent. Maya held her breath. The idea of her grandpa, a 70-year-old biker who looked like he belonged in a fight club, sitting behind a drum kit was absurd. She expected him to laugh, throw the sticks back, and tell them he was just an old man. But Vince didn't laugh. He looked down at the sticks in his hand, rubbing his thumb over the wood. He looked at the drum throne, then back at Dave. A strange look passed over his face, a look of memories, of things long past, of a time before he was a grandfather. I haven't sat behind a kit in 30 years, Vince said quietly. Like riding a bike, Dave said with a shrug. Come on. Just a basic beat. Let's hear what you got. Vince looked at Maya. Is the seat okay? Maya moved out of the way, her heart pounding. Yeah, it's fine. Vince walked over and sat down on the throne. The stool groaned under his weight, but he looked surprisingly comfortable. He adjusted the height, spinning the seat with practiced ease. He moved the snare drum a fraction of an inch to the left. He tightened the hi-hat clutch, then, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them, the gentle grandfather was gone. His hands hovered over the drums, wrists loose, fingers holding the sticks with a grip that looked as natural as breathing. All right, Vince rumbled. Let's see if the wrists still work. Maya watched, holding her breath, as her biker grandfather raised his right hand. The whole shop leaned in, waiting for a disaster, waiting for a clumsy noise. But what they were about to get was something nobody could have predicted. The drum stool let out a long, tired squeak as Vince lowered his heavy frame onto it. It was a small seat, designed for someone much smaller and lighter than him. His knees were nearly touching his chest, and his broad shoulders made him look like a giant hunched over a child's toy. The contrast was almost comical. The clerk, Dave, leaned back against the counter with a smirk, crossing his arms. He clearly expected a mess, maybe a clumsy attempt at a rhythm or a few loud, chaotic bangs before Vince gave up. Even Maya felt a little shy. She knew her grandpa was cool, but this was her world. She didn't want him to embarrass himself, and more than that, she didn't want the people watching to laugh at him. But Vince didn't look like he was trying to be funny. His face had changed completely. The friendly, slightly confused look he usually wore around modern technology was gone. In its place was a look of stone-cold focus. His eyes narrowed, staring at the snare drum with laser-like intensity. He didn't just sit there and wait, he reached out and adjusted the snare drum stand, twisting the wing nut with a sharp, precise motion. Then he moved the floor tom a few inches to the left. He spun the bass drum pedal with his hand, listening to the spring make a zing-zing sound. The smirk on Dave's face faded just a little bit. Musicians don't adjust other people's kits unless they know exactly what they are doing. A beginner just sits down and hits things. Vince was checking the setup like a mechanic inspecting an engine. "Ready when you are, big guy," Dave said, his voice a bit less confident than before. Vince didn't answer. He took the drumsticks in his hands. He didn't hold them like a novice, gripping them tight in the middle of the stick. Instead, he held them near the back, using a relaxed, matched grip that let the sticks bounce freely. He flipped one stick in the air, a fancy, casual trick, and caught it without looking. Then, he tapped the hi-hat cymbals 4 times. TSST, 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 TSST. It wasn't a rhythm. It was a sound check. He listened to the vibration, frowned slightly, and tightened the hi-hat clutch a tiny bit with his foot. He was tuning the cymbals on the fly. Maya took a step closer, her eyes wide. She had never seen this side of him. She remembered him tapping on the steering wheel when he drove her to school, but she always thought it was just nervous energy or a habit. Now, watching his wrists, she realized he was keeping a perfect, internal time. Suddenly, without counting out loud or asking if anyone was listening, Vince played a beat. It started simple. Kick, snare, kick, snare. It was the same beat Maya had played earlier, but it sounded completely different. Maya's beat was clean and careful, like a student trying to pass a test. Vince's beat had a feel to it. It was heavy. The bass drum didn't just make a sound, it punched the air. You could feel it in your chest. The snare crack was crisp, but there was a slight drag, a lazy, swing feeling that made you want to nod your head immediately. The guy with the green hair stopped chewing his gum. Dave uncrossed his arms and stood up straighter. The rhythm was solid. It wasn't a joke. Vince kept the beat going for a few bars, steady as a rock. He looked down at his hands, his face calm, almost bored. Then, he started to add things. First, he moved his right hand to the ride cymbal, playing a steady, ting-ting-a-ting pattern while his left hand stayed on the snare. Ting-ting-a-ting, boom-bap. It sounded like something you would hear on a classic rock record from the 70s. Then, he brought his right foot into play, double tapping the bass drum pedal. Boom boom, bap. Maya's mouth opened slightly. That was hard. Doing a double kick on a single pedal requires a lot of control in your ankle. Vince didn't even blink. His foot moved with the precision of a machine. He started to mix it up. He played a fill on the tom's tom, tom, snare, tom, and landed perfectly back on the beat. He was driving the rhythm like a fast car on a highway. The sound was getting louder. He wasn't hitting the drums as hard as he could, but the force came from his speed and his timing. Dave walked over to stand next to Maya. He watched Vince's feet, shaking his head in disbelief. Where did he learn that? Dave whispered, but Maya didn't know. She was watching her grandfather's face. There was a small smile there, a tiny grin that suggested he was remembering something good. He was in his own world now. The energy in the shop was shifting completely. 5 minutes ago, Vince was the scary biker everyone wanted to avoid. Now, he was the center of attention, but for a totally different reason. People were gathering around, not keeping a safe distance, but leaning in to watch. They were mesmerized. The rough-looking grandpa was playing with a soulfulness that you couldn't learn in a book. Vince seemed to notice the audience, but he didn't stop. Instead, he accelerated. The tempo went from a relaxed rock beat to a driving, faster pace. His wrists were blurring now. He was playing a syncopated rhythm, where the hands and feet were doing different things. It sounded complicated, a wall of sound that wrapped around the room. Maya felt the energy in her own body. She wanted to dance. The rhythm was so catchy, so powerful. It felt like the heartbeat of the shop. The dusty guitars on the wall seemed to vibrate in sympathy. Then, Vince looked up. He locked eyes with Maya, and for a second, the noise stopped in his head. He winked at her. It was a fast, cheeky wink. And right after that wink, he changed everything. The steady beat vanished. He brought his sticks down hard on the crash cymbal, letting it ring out, and then he launched into a roll. It wasn't a messy roll. It was a single-stroke roll that started slow and got faster and faster, like a machine gun firing up. The sticks were a blur, hitting every drum in the kit as he moved around the circle. The atmosphere wasn't just surprised anymore, it was electric. Everyone knew they were witnessing something special. The old biker wasn't just playing a beat anymore, he was speaking a language he hadn't spoken in years, and he was fluent. He was testing the limits of the kit, and the kid was loving it. The roof was still on the building, but the silence was definitely gone. The roll that Vince started didn't just speed up, it seemed to take flight. It was a smooth, continuous sound that started on the snare drum and then began to travel. Vince moved his hands in perfect unison, striking the tom-toms in a circle around the kit. The sound wasn't messy or chaotic. It was a rushing wave of noise that swept from the small drum on his left to the floor drum on his right, and then back again. Maya took a step back, her eyes wide. She knew enough to know that what she was watching was difficult. Keeping a roll even across different drums that have different pitches is hard. Doing it with power while looking totally relaxed is something only professionals can do. Vince wasn't frowning. He wasn't struggling. In fact, he looked like he was solving a math problem in his head, calm, focused, and entirely in control. Suddenly, the roll stopped. Vince slammed both sticks down on the crash cymbals simultaneously. Crash. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the guitar strings hanging on the wall nearby. The noise faded, but Vince didn't wait for silence. He immediately dropped into a groove that was far more complex than anything he had played before. His right foot began a pattern on the bass drum that went boom boom boom, hitting 3 times in rapid succession, matching the speed of his hands. This was a shuffle, a rhythm that had a swing to it, a bounce that made you want to tap your foot. But the speed he was playing it at was intense. It sounded like a freight train gaining speed down the tracks. The clerk, Dave, had walked over to the amplifier rack and turned off the background music playing in the store. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his jaw slightly open, his eyes glued to Vince's feet. Vince was now working the hi-hat with his left foot, opening and closing it in a rhythm that chattered tsst 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 in between the heavy thuds of the bass drum. He was doing 4 different things with his 4 limbs, and none of them were playing the same pattern. It was a wall of sound, tight and heavy. The guy with the green hair had abandoned his guitar completely. He was standing right next to the rope that separated the drum section from the rest of the store, his phone in his hand, recording a video. Maya could see his face on the screen, his eyebrows were practically touching his hairline. He looked from his phone to Vince, then back to the phone, as if he couldn't believe what the camera was capturing. Vince leaned into the kit. The leather vest creaked as he moved his torso, shifting his weight to get more power behind the hits. He started to sweat, a light sheen on his forehead, but he didn't wipe it away. He was locked in. He played a fill that involved crossing his hands right hand over left to hit the crash cymbal and the snare at the same time. Bap. Then, his left hand flicked out to hit the cowbell that was attached to the bass drum. Ping. Maya felt a chill run up her arms. She recognized that sound. It was a classic sound, something you heard on old records from the 60s and 70s. It was the sound of rock and roll when it was still raw and gritty. Her grandpa wasn't just hitting drums, he was playing with attitude. Every hit had a purpose. He was telling a story with the rhythm. It started low and rumbling, climbed up to a tense peak with the cymbals, and then came crashing back down to the heavy beat. The shop was filling up. People who had been browsing in the acoustic room wandered out to see what the noise was. An older woman, probably in her 70s, stopped near the entrance, listening. A young couple looking at a ukulele paused. Even the guy who had been sweeping the floor in the back leaned on his broom to watch. No one was talking. The only sounds were the shoes shuffling on the carpet and the earth-shaking rhythm coming from the drum kit. Vince's face was a mask of concentration, but there was a fire in his eyes that Maya had never seen. He looked younger. The years seemed to melt off his face. When he was 20, he was probably wild. Maya could see that wildness now, channeled entirely through his hands and feet. He started to play a pattern that was impossibly fast. His hands were a blur, moving so fast they looked like they were vibrating. He was hitting the rims of the drums, creating a clicking sound that mixed with the tone of the drum heads. Click click boom bap. It was a percussion solo within a solo. Then, he did something that made the clerk gasp. Without stopping his hands, Vince threw his right stick high up into the air. It spun over his head, a wooden helicopter against the ceiling lights. Everyone looked up, terrified he was going to drop it. But he didn't even look up. His left hand kept the rhythm going on the snare and hi-hat, filling in the gap perfectly. At the exact right millisecond, his right hand snatched the stick out of the air and brought it back down to hit the crash cymbal perfectly in time. Cray-ash. The shop seemed to shake. The guy with the green hair let out a whoa. That echoed in the silence that followed. The older lady clapped her hands together once and laughed in delight. Vince wasn't showing off for the sake of it. It didn't feel like arrogance. It felt like he was just so full of music that he had to let it out. Like a shaken bottle of soda that had finally been opened. He was playing with a joy that was contagious. Maya felt herself grinning, a huge, uncontrollable smile. This was her grandpa. The man who fixed her bike and bought her ice cream. He was a secret weapon. He built the solo back up again, starting with the bass drum thump, thump, and adding the snare snap, snap and then bringing in the toms. He was going around the drums faster now, changing the pitch as he went. low, middle, high, higher, crash. It sounded like a thunderstorm rolling across the sky. He was playing so hard that the snare drum actually slid a few inches across the floor, but he just adjusted his stance and kept playing like nothing happened. The volume was incredible. It wasn't painful, but it was powerful. You could feel the air moving. The sound filled every corner of the store, bouncing off the glass windows and the posters on the walls. It felt like the roof was being lifted off the building by the sheer energy of the beat. Vince's chest was heaving now. You could see the muscles in his forearms bulging as he struck the drums. He was giving it everything he had. This wasn't a polite test drive anymore. This was a performance. He was pouring decades of stored-up rhythm into these few minutes. He looked at Maya one last time, sweat dripping from his nose, and gave her a look that said, "Watch this." He launched into the final sequence. It was a manic, crazy display of speed. Hands and feet flying everywhere. Cymbals crashing, drums barking, the bell of the ride cymbal ringing like an alarm. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. It was the most exciting thing anyone in that shop had heard in years. And then, suddenly, Vince stopped. Not a slow fade out. A dead stop. His sticks froze in mid-air. His feet pressed the pedals down tight to stop the vibrations of the drums. His hands moved faster than Maya's eyes could track. He wasn't just hitting the drums anymore, he was turning into a whirlwind. The sound changed from a steady rhythm to a complex, driving force that felt like a heartbeat gone wild. He was playing a pattern on the hi-hat that was so crisp, it sounded like a typewriter on overdrive, while his bass drum foot was working like a piston, hammering out a steady, thumping beat that shook the floorboards. The clerk, Dave, had completely abandoned his casual stance. He was now standing right in front of the drum kit, his mouth slightly open, staring at Vince's feet. Dave played drums himself, or at least he thought he did until this moment. He knew how hard it was to keep a 4-on-the-floor beat steady while playing intricate patterns with your hands. Vince was doing it effortlessly. The man looked like he was sitting on his front porch, relaxed and calm, but his limbs were producing a sound that was strictly professional. Suddenly, Vince changed the beat. He opened up the hi-hat and crashed the ride cymbal at the same time. The sound was huge and metallic, cutting through the air like a siren. He began to roll on the toms again, moving from the high tom to the floor tom and back up, weaving a melody with the drums. He wasn't just keeping time, he was making the drums sing. He was dancing on the skins, hitting the edges of the drums for a clicking sound, then hitting the center for a deep thud. The crowd, which had gathered silently, was now exchanging wide-eyed looks. The guy with the green hair was nodding his head vigorously, a look of pure respect on his face. You couldn't fake this. You couldn't practice for a few weeks and sound like this. This came from years of playing, from deep inside the soul. Vince's face was glistening with sweat now. A drop ran down his temple and into his gray beard, but he didn't wipe it away. He was in a trance. The leather vest creaked as he leaned into a fill, throwing his whole body into the music. He played a pattern that crossed his hands over each other, left hand hitting the crash cymbal while the right hand dug into the snare drum. It was risky, tricky, and dangerous, but he nailed it every single time. He began to build up the tension. The beat got faster. The bass drum was thundering now, a relentless barrage of sound that vibrated in everyone's chest. The cymbals were sizzling, a constant wall of white noise that roared like an ocean wave. Maya felt like she was standing in the center of a storm made of wood, metal, and pure rhythm. Just when Maya thought he couldn't possibly go any faster or play any harder, Vince did the unthinkable. He threw his right stick up in the air. It spun high, nearly hitting the ceiling lights. Everyone gasped. But Vince didn't even look up. His left hand kept the rhythm going on the hi-hat and snare, filling the gap perfectly without missing a single beat. His right hand caught the falling stick by the butt end without even looking, brought it back down, and slammed it onto the crash cymbal in perfect syncopation. It was the ultimate show of control. It was a move usually reserved for rock stars in arenas, not grandfathers in music shops. Vince launched into the finale. His hands were a blur, a chaotic whirlwind of motion. He was hitting every drum in sight, creating a wall of sound that was dizzying. The rhythm was complex, shifting from straight time to a swing feel and back again. He was playing with a ferocity that belied his age. The energy in the room was electric, the air felt charged, like right before a lightning strike. The sound was deafening in the best way possible. It was filling every corner of the shop, bouncing off the walls, rattling the windows. It felt like the roof was literally being lifted off the building by the sheer power of the groove. The dusty old shop had been transformed into a concert hall. And then, with one final, massive crescendo, a thunderous roll on the floor tom and a stomp on the bass drum that sounded like a cannon blast, Vince stopped. He didn't fade out. He cut it off cold. Silence rushed back into the room. The cymbals sizzled for a split second and then died. The last echo of the snare drum faded away into the rafters. Vince sat there, chest heaving, sticks resting on his knees, looking down at the floor. The shop was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the back room. Maya stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like she had just run a marathon. Her grandpa, the quiet, scary-looking biker who drove her everywhere, had just blown the roof off the place. The secret was out. He wasn't just a grandfather. He was a drummer. A real one. The silence that followed the final crash of the cymbal was heavy, pressing against the walls of the small shop. It was the kind of quiet that feels loud, where your own breathing sounds like thunder. Vince sat frozen on the drum stool, his chest rising and falling, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His head was bowed slightly, the gray braids of his beard falling forward. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The guy with the green hair was still holding his phone up, his mouth wide open. The clerk, Dave, was leaning against the amp as if he had been pushed there. Even the older lady by the door was staring. Then, Dave let out a long, low whistle. Phew. It broke the spell. Suddenly, the shop erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. The young guy with the green hair started hooting and stomping his boots on the floor. The clerk burst into applause, shouting yes. That's what I'm talking about. Maya felt a rush of adrenaline so strong it made her knees weak. She started clapping too, her hands stinging, a huge grin stretching across her face. Vince looked up, blinking as if he was waking up from a dream. The noise washed over him, and for a second, he looked confused, like he didn't know where he was. Then, a look of shy embarrassment crossed his face. He quickly stood up, the drum stool groaning in relief. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and ducked his head, trying to hide behind his shoulder. Okay, settle down, Vince mumbled, but he was smiling. It was a small, crooked smile, but it reached his eyes. That was incredible. Dave shouted, walking over with so much energy he almost tripped over a guitar cable. I mean, seriously. Where did you learn to play like that? I've been working in this shop for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Vince shrugged his massive shoulders, the leather creaking. Just had a good teacher, a long time ago. And lots of practice. That wasn't just practice, man, the guy with the green hair piped up, stepping closer. He looked at Vince with total respect, no longer scared of the biker vest or the tattoos. That was pro level. Are you in a band? Can I get your number? We need a drummer. Vince chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. Sorry, son. I'm retired. My touring days are done. Maya stepped forward, still looking at him with wonder. She had known him her whole life, but she felt like she was meeting a stranger. A wonderful, talented stranger. Grandpa, she said, her voice shaking a little. You never told me. You never said you could play like that. Vince looked down at her, and his expression softened. The tough biker exterior melted away completely. He reached out and gently patted the top of her head with his big, calloused hand. You never asked, kiddo, he said softly. To you, I've just always been Grandpa. The guy who fixes cars and rides the motorcycle. But that was amazing, Maya said. Why did you stop? Why don't you play anymore? Vince looked around the shop, at the drums, at the people clapping. He seemed to be looking backward in time, into his own past. Music was my life before you were born, Vince explained, his voice quiet but clear. I was young and wild. I played in bands all over the country. I lived in vans, I ate bad food, and I played in smoky bars until 3 in the morning. It was fun, sure. But it was also lonely. He paused, looking at Maya with love in his eyes. Then your mom came along, and later, you. I realized that the road wasn't a place for a family. I wanted to be around to watch you grow up. I wanted to be here to teach you how to ride a bike and help you with your homework. So, I hung up the sticks. I traded the drums for a toolbox and a motorcycle. I didn't regret it for a second. Maya felt a lump in her throat. She realized then that her grandpa hadn't given up his passion because he failed, he gave it up because he loved her more. He sacrificed his spotlight to be her hero in the shadows. Dave, the clerk, wiped his eyes dramatically. Well, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. But honestly, sir, you shouldn't let those hands get rusty. That was too good to hide. Vince laughed again. He handed the drumsticks back to Dave. Maybe. But today was about Maya. He turned back to the drum kit. He ran his hand over the snare drum one last time, tapping it gently. It still rang with the memory of the solo. This is a good drum, Vince said to Maya. The brass shell has a lot of cut. It's perfect for the kind of music you want to play. If you keep practicing, you're going to be better than I ever was. Maya beamed at him. Coming from anyone else, that would have been a nice compliment. Coming from the man who had just blown the roof off the shop, it was the best praise she could ever receive. Are you going to buy it? Dave asked, looking hopeful. I think it likes you. And I think it likes your grandpa, too. Maya looked at Vince. He nodded. If it's what you want, kiddo. Let's get it. As Dave went to the counter to ring up the sale, the atmosphere in the shop felt different. The fear was gone. The customers were smiling at Vince, chatting with him like he was an old friend. The guy with the green hair high-fived him on the way out. It was amazing what a little music could do. It had broken down the wall of prejudice that usually surrounded Vince. A few minutes later, Maya walked out of the shop carrying the shiny brass snare drum case by its handle. It was heavy, but she didn't mind. Vince walked beside her, the shop's bell jingling as they exited. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the street and the row of parked cars. Vince took a deep breath of the fresh air, stretching his arms wide. "So," Maya said as they walked toward his parked motorcycle. "Are you going to teach me that role you did, the one that sounded like a machine gun?" Vince looked down at her and winked. "Maybe. If you practice your rudiments first. You have to learn to walk before you can run, kid." He swung his leg over the massive chrome motorcycle, the machine roaring to life with a rumble that sounded surprisingly like the bass drum he had been playing earlier. He handed Maya a helmet. Maya put the helmet on, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. She strapped the snare drum case to the back of the bike with bungee cords, securing it tightly. As she climbed on behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, she realized something. She didn't just have a grandfather who took care of her. She had a mentor. She had a legend. "Hang on tight," Vince shouted over the engine noise. "Let's go home." As the bike pulled away from the curb and onto the open road, Maya squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the engine. It wasn't a jazz beat, and it wasn't a rock solo. It was the heartbeat of the road, the soundtrack of their lives together. And she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of their duet. She couldn't wait to get home and set up her new drum. And maybe, just maybe, she could get her grandpa to sit down on the throne one more time.